You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 298 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, we're starting off talking about this recent reporting of an FBI investigation into Donald Trump being influenced by Russia. We had the release of this report on the crash of the USS Fitzgerald a few years ago that killed 7 American sailors. Then there's some news out of Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela that I want to talk about as well. Just want to remind everybody that the 300th episode of the show is coming up next week. I got a really great interview lined up for that. So you don't want to miss the show, and subscribe to it on one of the podcatchers out there. For those of you that like to, listen on a web browser, libertarianinstitute.org is where you can find all my work. My daily news roundups there, as well as the show. It's an easy place to share the show. So think about doing that, and I really appreciate what people do there. It's how it gets out there to new listeners and continues to grow. And if anybody wants to donate to the show and get access to a little bit bonus content that I do produce, I'm going to try to get out another episode within the next week. You can find the show on patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so let's start off with this FBI investigation. It starts in 2017, right after the firing of James Comey. Of course, it's hard to believe this is only a little less than 2 years ago that Trump fired James Comey. Fairly publicly. He was like giving a speech. He got off stage and they're like, oh, so you've been fired as director of the FBI. And it's many stories ago and many phases of the Russiagate saga ago. But that firing provoked the FBI to carry out this investigation, I guess, centered around the premise that Trump was being influenced by Russia. Now, at the time, most of the evidence for this claim is just mainly hysteria coming out about maybe Russia was buying some Facebook ads, and then you had this report that was basically just a hand-picked collection of analysts' thoughts on if Russia influenced the U.S. election, and remember, mainly centered around the fact that RT exists. And so there was a recent article in Consortium News, and I'll go and link to this in the show notes page just because for those of you who don't remember the memo, basically what, I think it was an intelligence assessment, not a memo, Ray McGovern goes through and basically breaks the whole thing down again with the information we know 2 years later, and really just goes to show that, any of the Russiagate evidence that came from that intelligence assessment is, absolutely should be dismissed now. All right, so I'm going to get into kind of the debunking here, and most of what I have comes from two places. The Ron Paul Liberty Report. Dan McAdams and Ron Paul do a fantastic job of breaking this thing down. So I'll link to that in the show notes page. And then Glenn Greenwald has a great write-up in The Intercept that not only, is a great breakdown of this whole investigation, but also on some historical context here. And really, he emphasizes the dangers of this investigation. I guess the best place to start here is that in the New York Times reporting on this investigation, they basically conclude the investigation went nowhere. They do this, they look into it, and they don't find anything, obviously, because Donald Trump is still president, and he's not at trial as the FBI has recommended charges against him. And so, it seems on the face of it that this should be a win for the Trump administration. The FBI looked into it, they found nothing, so that should mean that just more evidence that Russia didn't influence the 2016 election and doesn't have anything on Donald Trump making him a Manchurian candidate. That is now just... you have all these, establishment hats like Jennifer Rubin and Strobe Talbot and Matt Smoot that just go out there and say, the Trump is a Manchurian candidate. Trump is clearly, controlled by Russia, and, Russia won the 2016 election for Donald Trump. And they say that as fact, hoping that everybody's just going to adopt the point, kind of like they did leading up to the Iraq war. And so the way this whole thing is being spun is that it's somehow an indictment of Donald Trump that the investigation happened in the first place, that the FBI looked into Donald Trump after Donald Trump fired the FBI director. The media isn't focusing on the FBI and maybe them doing something a little bit outside an abuse of power. No, the focus is all on Donald Trump and the fact that the FBI looked into him. So anyways, important, nothing's found. I think it's important to remember kind of the structure of the FBI at this point. Now disgraced Andrew McCabe, who was eventually fired, was the acting head of the FBI at this time. You still had Peter Strzok and Lisa Page on staff, two FBI lovers, both married, carrying on extramarital affairs with each other. And we have a text message record to prove that they were in a conspiracy to try to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president of the United States. I mean, they talk about it. I think some of it was bluffing on the fact of Peter Strzok. Maybe he's trying to make himself look very important in the eyes of a girl. And, I'm not saying that this is a elaborate conspiracy or anything, but the two of these, definitely talked about trying to undermine Trump's election victory. In the Glenn Greenwald article specifically, I think he does a pretty good job of not only taking on the New York Times, as they are the original people to report this, but just in general, the mainstream media's reaction and reporting of this event. And so if you kind of want to see what I talk about when I say, the mainstream media really focuses just on reporting the fact that this investigation happens and that somehow reflects negatively on Trump. Another brilliant point that Glenn Greenwald makes in his piece is just the dangers of having the FBI look at a presidential policy and saying that this is somehow at least circumstantial evidence that he may possibly be under the influence of a foreign power. And so, essentially what you have here is, at the time everybody is saying, and all the analysts are saying, you had the Matt's Boots out there and everybody else in the mainstream saying, oh my God, Donald Trump is going to move the U.S. closer to Russia. Of course, Donald Trump was talking about getting along better with Russia and saying that he felt like he could get along with President Putin, and really criticizing Obama for failing with, their attempt to improve relations with Russia. I mean, remember, under the Obama years, and specifically as Hillary Clinton is a candidate, you had the Russia reset. And while I don't think Trump ever really specifically mentions that policy, he does talk about how he's not going to screw up Russian relations like Hillary Clinton did. And, this is kind of part of the 2016 campaign. And then, bleeds into the early days of his administration when he's talking about getting along better with Putin and, what his eventual Syria policy will look like. Now, we know in the 2-year sense that Trump has been absolutely horrific on Russia, almost even worse than Obama. Now, I think there are still some benefits of the Trump policy just because Trump seems to want to get along with Putin, even though the U.S. and Russia have been locked in, sanctions battle. I do want to point out here that the U.S. is, threatening to sanction German companies for helping to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to bring energy from Russia to Europe at, a cheaper, more efficient way. So, Trump is threatening sanctions there. This is in line with the Obama policy. He has not backed down on Ukraine at all, or the Ukrainian and American claims that the Crimean Peninsula is, belongs to Ukraine and not Russia. And when you look at things like the Skripal poisoning, where with very little evidence whatsoever, the United States ends up withdrawing 50 or expelling 50 Russia ambassadors from the United States, and then Russia taking reciprocal actions. And of course, you still have the NATO buildup out there on Russia's border. And so all these things have happened. And again, should be proof evidence that Trump isn't a puppet of Vladimir Putin. I mean, at this point, John Bolton is national security advisor, and Trump is talking about withdrawing from the INF treaty, a critical treaty in U.S.-Russian relations. But back to Greenwald's point here, I know I got away from it on a little bit of a tangent, is just that, the FBI shouldn't be able to investigate a president based on, what they let their foreign policy to be. And so, just because Barack Obama met with the King of Saudi Arabia and had a favorable policy towards Saudi Arabia didn't mean that the FBI should have carried out an investigation to see if, King Solomon had any, P-tapes of Barack Obama. And again, I pointed out before that Greenwald gives a lot of historical context on the dangers of what could happen here and how, it could deter, a president or a politician from taking a position if it means you're going to get investigated by the FBI. I've started to see some tweets out, and this is, not anything confirmed, so take it for what it is, but I'm seeing these kind of tweets and stories coming out, and sometimes from mainstream sources, saying that, they have sources within either the Mueller investigation or in the FBI, basically saying that they don't expect much from the actual Mueller investigation report. Now, they're going to, I'm sure, find little ways to explain this away and how Trump still colluded with Russia. But at the end of the day, it looks like I think they're starting to prepare people for a nothing from the Mueller investigation. Oh, and that's one more thing I want to talk about the FBI investigation of Donald Trump. I believe Dan McAdams is the one that points this out, that the DOJ was not aware of this investigation going on. And so, that was kind of a breach of how things are supposed to work as far as, the executive branch powers of the United States of America. All right, so this report on the USS Fitzgerald crash, it happened, I believe, 2 years ago now, sometime in 2017. And this was really a part of a rash of incidents for the U.S. 7th Fleet, which operates, in the Indo-Pacific area. A lot of what the U.S. has been doing here is carrying out these freedom of navigation exercises either in the Taiwan Strait or around Chinese claimed islands in the South China Sea. And, you had the threats to North Korea and stuff as well. So anyways, you had these incidents occur like, with the Fitzgerald and with the McCain, two U.S. destroyers, where significant damage is done to the U.S. ships and sailors died. 7 sailors died in the case of this crash of the Fitzgerald. And within, I think, 40-something days, so a little less than 2 months or so, here, you had a report out by the Navy that is just now being made public. It's an internal investigation by a rear admiral. So certainly not somebody outside the mainstream who's going to be overcritical of the military or anything like that. And basically, I'll link to this article from the Navy Times so you can read about all the little details of everything wrong. But it's just a complete disaster. Command had completely broken down on the ship. They're talking about how commanding officers weren't showing up for their duties. They, weren't high enough ranking officers to make decisions. You had situations where you had the U.S., this destroyer operating, in kind of a dangerous situation as that night they're carrying out kind of complicated maneuvers and the right personnel aren't on deck. He talks about walking into one room and finding, and I think it's supposed to be like a monitoring room, finding urine bottles laying all over and kettlebells, people not trained properly for their jobs. I think he at one point quizzed 22 officers on the ship on protocol, and only 3 of them scored above an 80%. So obviously we have a case here that's at the very best rampant mismanagement of very expensive U.S. ships. And remember, these ships includes the lives of the sailors on them, and 7 people end up dying. And who knows, the 7 people who end up dying could have been involved in a different department doing everything right. And, they just unfortunately are killed. I guess the first, thing that really surprises me here is the lack of any kind of congressional demands that something happen. I mean, there is this portrayal in the, kind of U.S. culture that the military are all these MacArthur, Patton type figures. The generals wake up at 3 a.m., go on a 5-mile run. They eat 1 meal a day. They read books. They're constantly training. They never, maybe others than smoking cigars and having whiskey. They're the models of perfect health. They're the most disciplined men in the world. They make their bed every morning. They line everything up. They always look sharp. And so, if you really investigate this, I guess, you have a case where this is a Navy ship. And so the whole command of the ship is, all military. You really can't blame anybody but the military. And this really makes the Navy look sloppy. Now, I do know that eventually the commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet was fired. And so I wonder if this report had anything to do with it. In this article from the Navy Times, and like I said, I'll link to it in the show notes page, it also mentions that there's a report done on the USS McCain incident. So we'll see if maybe that gets released in the wake of this, and if maybe we could get one of our senators or congressmen to kind of hold some kind of committee hearing on this, to really expose, the mismanagement of, U.S. ships out there. All right, so there's some updates on Venezuela. I'm hoping to have Brian Sadie back on the show soon to give me a little bit more analysis, but I just want to fill everybody in on the details that I think are somewhat significant. You had the United States and Mike Pompeo visiting Brazil a couple weeks ago, and as I've mentioned in the past on the show, there are, I think, growing conflicts between Brazil and Venezuela. I'm not sure how this changes with the election of the new Brazilian Prime Minister, I believe, Bolsonaro. Being a more right-wing populist type. And of course you have Maduro, who is the communist. if there's going to be increased clashes because of that. But I had talked about how you had almost like these cross-border incidents where Venezuelan refugees are coming over the Brazilian border and getting into conflicts with some of the Brazilian people. So that happens. And then Mike Pompeo said that there needs to be a new government in Venezuela, and has more or less kind of endorsed this idea that the new prime minister or leader of Venezuela should be the opposition leader of the parliament. For whatever reason, the claim is that the parliamentary elections are more legitimate. I'll see if, when I talk to Brian, if he knows why. But that's the claim. And then you had Brazil recognize him as the rightful leader of Venezuela, as well as the Organization of American States, which is like a regional power group. I'm not sure how much power the OAS has, but I'm guessing it's kind of like the Arab League or OPEC, or probably less centralized power than the European Union, where the member states are able to do generally what they want. But the fact that you have these recognitions is interesting. Don't know if I've actually seen this type of coup before, where you just recognize somebody else as the leader of the country, and I guess we'll see what happens. I mean, I really doubt that Russia or China would ever go along with this, and since the United States of America is so heavily isolated itself from Venezuela, I don't think we would really be able to exert any influence over who we see as the rightful leader of the country from like an economic standpoint, since Russia and China are involved with a lot of their trade, and then also regional partners as well. Cuba is, I think, specifically. On the topic of, U.S. sanctions and oil and everything like that, there is South Korea resuming oil imports from Iran. I thought this was a crazy development. South Korea is a state well within the U.S. orbit and has so far gone along with, U.S. sanctions against North Korea, even when they don't agree with them. But now I guess has gotten exemption, not a sanction, from the United States for the sanctions against Iran to buy Iranian oil. I have felt that, Donald Trump's policy towards Iran, his hatred for the Iran deal was a sincere, deeply held position of Donald Trump. I don't think it's right. I think it's stupid, but I do think that's what Donald Trump believes. And so it's interesting that he's giving all these countries leeway on these sanctions because, if the United States really, I guess, wants the policy that Donald Trump thinks he's implementing in Iran to work, he really has to shut off, the oil exports. And yet it's continuing to go on. And, with these exports to South Korea, I'm sure it'll be helpful to the Iranian economy. And I don't want to make this sound like a bad thing. I think trade is always a good thing. But it's just seems counter to what Trump's policy should be. There's a statement out from the Afghan army. It's an article where they basically just talked to, I guess, a bunch of Afghan officials. And they all say that we absolutely 100% need the U.S. Air Force. And they're, talking about how concerned they are about the drawdown. But I do want to emphasize here that, a point for the United States saying in Afghanistan is now that if we leave, the Afghans can't defend their own country from the Taliban. When it seems to me that after 17 years, that should be a point in the favor of, well, we should probably leave if at this point we're still essential to the central state there. So I have to say, I'm pretty confused on the Syrian withdrawal thing as far as if I think it'll actually happen and if Donald Trump has actually put conditions on that withdrawal. I would say it seems like no, but all I really say is seems like. Donald Trump did come out with this statement basically threatening Turkey with economic pressure if they were to try to invade Syrian Kurdistan. So that seems like a good thing to me. I imagine that if Donald Trump is making the threat saying that if you invade Syrian Kurdistan, I'm going to put economic pressure on you, is a far different statement than if you invade Syrian Kurdistan, American troops will be there and then you'll have a fight with them. And so it seems to me that Donald Trump is kind of saying, well, we're leaving. It's just if we're going to continue our economic relationship with Turkey. That being said, I could have it completely wrong because his administration officials certainly aren't echoing that position. But who knows, how much influence John Bolton and Mike Pompeo actually have over Trump's policy and what's happening. It does seem we had this story out from the New York Times, I believe was originally misreported that U.S. troops have begun leaving Syria, but that we have started moving some equipment out of Syria. The Yemen drone attack that I talked about in the last show, Houthis launched an attack against Aden. Mainstream media blames the Houthis for the ceasefire falling apart. Don't really agree with that take, and, I think it's a far different situation than that. But I do want to, mention that it's worth knowing that the Yemeni government, so the Saudi-backed government of Yemen's military intel chief was killed in the attack. So this was, I don't know, how important this guy is or how replaceable he is, but I'm sure in Yemen it kind of makes a big deal kind of thing to have such a high-ranking official be killed in a Houthi attack. I think it shows a lot of weakness from the Saudi-backed government there. And you really wonder, what's going to happen, as it seems the war's in a stalemate. You have the two sides, I guess, refusing to sit in the same room right now during the UN talks. And what could actually happen? And the Houthis just get more and more powerful. All right, finishing up here, I just want to mention Zimbabwe, because I did cover the coup on the show and kind of, the development since then with the ousting of the 37-year-long leader, Robert Mugabe, and, his wife, Grace, who was expected to be the next leader of Zimbabwe. You have the coup, new elections, and I don't know how legitimately you have a new president. The situation in Zimbabwe has not improved. So I'm guessing the president overpromised. I'm not sure if he's making corruption worse in the country or anything like that. So I can't say exactly if the people should be demanding the leader's head on a pike, but it's clear that situations in Zimbabwe have not been improving very much. You had the rampant hyperinflation there, price increases, not much economic opportunity, unfortunately. And so the people are protesting again. The protests got violent. 3 people were killed. The president responded by putting military in the streets. And so, all right, that's where we wrap up the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Remember to subscribe to the show so you get all the great interviews I have coming up next week. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. You can find my daily news roundup now at the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus website and minds.com/immersion news.